nonsense remains nonsense, even if brilliant scientists talk it. Sadly, Stephen Hawking, he was a brilliant mathematician and theoretical physicist, but he had no idea about philosophy and no idea about theology. And in fact, our astronomer royal, Lord Martin Rees, said nobody should listen to him on either of those two things.
Greetings, everyone. Today I have the privilege to have a conversation with Dr. John Lennox. John Lennox is an emeritus professor of mathematics at Oxford University and an internationally renowned speaker on the interface of science, philosophy, and religion. Dr. Lennox is also an emeritus fellow in mathematics and philosophy of science at Green Templeton College. He teaches at many academic institutions and is a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum. He has written many books such as God's Undertaker and Can Science Explain Everything? He has had many public debates with atheists, including Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, and others. Dr. Lennox, thank you for making time for this interview.
It's a great pleasure to be talking with you this morning in Albania.
I want to start with this. Do you see any conflict between being a Christian and a scientist? In other words, do Christians have to commit an intellectual suicide to be a believer and a scientist at the same time?
Not at all. I see a conflict between being an atheist and a scientist, but not a conflict between being a Christian and a scientist. There are quite a few reasons for that. But the first reason is the one that's easily stated and frequently forgotten. And that is that in the 16th and 17th century, there was an explosion that led to what we call modern science. People like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. And they all believed in God. And C.S. Lewis, commenting on this, put it very well when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, a legislator. And I often say to people, you know, the modern science is essentially a gift from the Judeo-Christian tradition. It springs directly out of the biblical worldview. So I'm not remotely ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian. Now, if you like, we can go later into the fact why I think it's atheism and science that are incompatible, and we'll probably get there in the end.
Yeah, I could not resist here to ask you this question. Now, as a mathematician who has taught for so long, perhaps at the top academic institution in the world, the University of Oxford, how it is the case that you believe in the biblical doctrine of the Trinity? In other words, a great mathematician like yourself believes that 1, God the Father, plus 1, God the Son, plus 1, God the Holy Spirit, equals 1. Are you sure you're not committing intellectual suicide here?
Yes, but that's bad mathematics. It's not intellectual suicide at all. What we call the doctrine of the Trinity, that word doesn't even appear in the Bible. But as has been said long ago by a much more brilliant man than I, Tom Torrance, he said the Trinity is not a Christian doctrine. It's much more than that. It's the way God has revealed himself. And in Scripture, we see God the Son, God the Father, and God the Holy Spirit. There is one God. But there are, so to speak, 3 dimensions to that one God. And C.S. Lewis used geometry to indicate this. A cube has 3 dimensions, but it's one cube. And these are just simple little mathematical illustrations. But in science itself, at its deepest level, we are used to dealing with things that are apparently contradictory. For example, light behaves sometimes as waves and sometimes as particles. And therefore, in one sense, for scientists, the idea that God is sophisticated and complex and contains 3 in 1 in some sense I don't find that difficult at all. I expect reality to be complex. It's, a real car is much more complicated than a toy car, but I prefer the real one.
Yeah. Have you ever bullied about your faith in God, among the circles that you work or when you grew up or when you went to school?
Well, I've experienced quite a bit of opposition. I suppose when I was growing up, but a very long time ago, when I first went to Cambridge, a Nobel Prize winner tried to get me to give up my Christian faith, and that was very dramatic. He brought me to his room and with some other senior members of the university, and he asked me, did I want to have a career in science? And I said yes. And he said, all right, if you want to have a career in science, then you should, this evening in front of witnesses, renounce your naive faith in God, because if you stick with that, you'll never make it. You will suffer by comparison with your peers. And I asked him, it was some pressure, I tell you. I said, tell me, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I have in Jesus Christ? And he came out, to my amazement, with the evolutionary philosophy of Émile Bergson. And that was a very bad choice. Firstly, because I'd heard of Bergson through C.S. Lewis. And secondly, although I didn't know it at the time, Bergson, towards the end of his life, wanted to convert to Catholicism from Judaism. So he wasn't a good choice. And I said, if that's all you've got to offer me, then I will stick with what I've got and I'll take the risk. And that was very important in my life, because it put steel into my soul, and it made me determined that if ever I got into the kind of position I now am in academically, I would never, ever do that kind of thing to people. People. Just imagine if that man had been a Christian and I'd been an atheist student, and news had got out of what he tried to do, then he'd have lost his job the next day. So it was a very important event, although it was quite horrific at the time.
Now, one of the heroes among Christian intellectuals of the past for me is, of course, C.S. Lewis. And I think you have been a student at the time when he was still a professor. Is that correct?
Yes. In 1962, I went to Cambridge and Lewis was still there. He died the following year, but he was still giving some lectures. And I went to several of them, and they turned out to be the last lectures he ever gave. So I'm very pleased that C.S. Lewis, who had such an effect on my life intellectually through his books, that I at least encountered him several times in the flesh.
That's wonderful to have that kind of experience. Now, when I was doing my reading to prepare for this interview, I was fascinated to learn that modern science was developed only in the Christian West, the modern science. And as you mentioned, some of the earliest modern scientists. What do you think were the necessary requirements for the birth of modern science that the Christian worldview provided in the West?
Well, the best way to answer that is to consider why it didn't develop in the East, principally not in China, because a lot of research was done by an expert on the Chinese language and Chinese science and technology, Joseph Needham, who was a chemist. And the interesting thing is that in his own philosophy, he was a neo-Marxist, and for many years he tried to reconcile the lack of development of abstract science in China with neo-Marxism, and he couldn't do so. And in the end, he honestly admitted that the only difference he could see between the East and the West was that China in particular lacked the idea of a single creator who created the universe to run on fixed laws. And of course, that's exactly what Kepler, Newton, and Galileo believed, that there was a God who created the universe, a rational God, and therefore, in doing science, we are glorifying God and we're thinking God's thoughts after him. And I think that's a very important distinction. Richard Dawkins once challenged me and said on this topic, he said, look, everybody believed in God at that time. And I simply made the point, not everybody, Richard. Most people in the West believed in God, but certainly not in the East. So comparing those two, it's certainly clear that the Judeo-Christian cradle, so to speak, gave birth to modern science. And that is a thesis, by the way, that's widely believed. Indeed, there's an even stronger version of it. Peter Harrison, who was for a while professor of science and religion at Oxford, and whom I knew quite well, he has written a book that's gained widespread commendation, arguing that it wasn't only the biblical doctrine of creation that inspired modern science, but it was the attitude of the reformers to scripture, moving away from allegorical interpretations. They said, look, we need to see what the text actually says. And taking that back into science, you get Kepler, who was desperately trying to fit the motions of the planets around the sun into circles, and he couldn't do it until he finally said, right, that's Aristotle's philosophy. Let me leave that aside and let me just look at what is going on. And very rapidly he saw they moved in equally perfect ellipses. So looking at what the text says, whether the text is the written word of God or the text of the universe, God's book of nature, is a very important part of the way in which science works.
Now, if it was the Christian foundation of the West in which the modern science was born, why is the case that the scientific world today in the West is dominated by a naturalistic worldview?
I think there is a number of reasons for that. It's quite a complicated business. And of course, naturalism or materialism have been with us right since the ancient atomism of Democritus and Leucippus. They've always been there. And at the time of the Enlightenment, where there was a very strong reaction against a corrupt version of Christianity, and many people saw that and they didn't like it, and I don't like it either, of course. And they tended to move to pushing God out of the equation. And they came up with a kind of view that we now call deism, where God started the universe off, he wound it up, and it runs like a clock. Now, ironically, that view was helped by Isaac Newton's view of a clockwork universe. So inadvertently, Newton, who believed in God himself, was providing a background for those that didn't want God in the picture. And gradually God got pushed back, and people started to ask, well, he's pushed back to winding the clock up. Do we need God at all? There was that. But then there was the aftermath of the Huxley-Wilberforce debate in 1860, just after Charles Darwin. And that has been much misinterpreted. The argument being that Huxley was a genius atheist and that Wilberforce was an ignorant man in the church, a cleric who didn't understand science, and Huxley won. Well, that's not true, actually. Wilberforce was a brilliant man of science. Yes, he was a Christian. But the interesting thing is, although many people say that Wilberforce used Christian arguments, biblical arguments, to fight against Darwin's evolutionary view, that's not true either. I've read the entire interchange and what Wilberforce wrote. And he explicitly said, I'm not going to use arguments from Christianity. I'm simply going to use biblical arguments. And Charles Darwin, commenting on what Wilberforce said, remarked, he has discovered all the weak points in my thesis. I think the real situation in terms of sociology and the culture of the time, Huxley was dead against the idea of the amateur naturalist, that is, scientists who were in the church and were paid to teach the church, but they had a lot of free time and they did some amateur naturalist work. Huxley wanted to abolish the churches, turn the buildings into temples to Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, and have a band of professional scientists. So that is all in the background. And of course, the experience of the Enlightenment, particularly in France, the strong reaction against a corrupt church, which is understandable, led, of course, to an increase in pushing God out of the scene. And that's the background to many of the contemporary atheists like Dawkins or the late Stephen Hawking, Christopher Hitchens, and so on. They are, in a sense, Enlightenment men, but they're building on a rotten foundation for many reasons that I've gone into. Indeed, I've just written a major book, Replacing God's Undertaker, which is called Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, in order to go into this in detail.
So one of your books that I've enjoyed reading, Can Science Explain Everything? I want to focus a little bit on that book. Before we try to give an answer to that question, could you please define what science is?
Defining science is more difficult than many people think. And indeed, philosophers of science have given up trying to formulate a precise definition. Nowadays, they tend to say science is associated with ideas like the following: setting up a hypothesis and then testing it by doing repeated experimentation, then refining the hypothesis on the basis of what you've discovered, and so on. That is an inductive approach. And that's very powerful, of course, and is a reasonable way of thinking about an aspect of science. The problem is that you cannot test everything that's out there by repeated experimentation. You cannot test, for example, the origin of the universe or of life. And that means we have to introduce another element into science, which we might call a historical approach. And that is the approach that both historians and forensic medics use. You cannot repeat Caesar's invasion of Britain to see if it happened or not. You have to make an inference to the best explanation on the basis of texts, of historical reports, and all that kind of thing. We call that abductive explanation, or inference to the best explanation. That's the easier term, and we use it all the time. If you like Agatha Christie, which most of us do, and Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian detective, he is brought to the scene of a murder, and he cannot say, well, let's just do the murder again to see who did it. That's absurd. But that doesn't mean you cannot find who did it by using inference and reason. So there are two aspects to science. Inductive science tends to have more authority than inference, the best explanation. They're both important. That gives us a bit of an idea of what science is, but precise definitions are very difficult. Augustine once said, everybody knows what time is until you try to define it.
So having those definitions that you provided, what would be the limitation of science? What are some questions or phenomena or events that science cannot explain?
First of all, we need to remind ourselves that Europe is linguistically divided. And in the UK, science means the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. Whereas there are other cultures, like the German culture, that uses the name Wissenschaft for both the natural sciences and the humanities. And that's an indicator where the natural sciences are limited. Now, we have a huge problem today because some of the leading atheists are infected, I'd put it that way, with the worldview that's called scientism. Scientism asserts that the natural sciences are the only way to knowledge and truth. Now, that is clearly false. It's logically false because the statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science. It's a statement about science. It doesn't come from science. And therefore, if it's true, it's false. But looking at it in more depth, one of the very famous Oxford Nobel Prize winners was Sir Peter Medawar. And he once wrote that it's very easy to see that the natural sciences are limited because they cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of my life? And this is hugely important. Science is powerful precisely because it's limited. And one of the places where it is limited, where it cannot go, is the most important question for human beings of all questions, and that is meaning. Where do I get meaning from? And our late chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was a brilliant philosopher, put it this way. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. Science doesn't have that capacity to deal with meaning. Einstein, who was one of the brightest scientists ever, he once said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. In other words, to put it more simply, science can tell us that if you give arsenic to your grandmother, it will kill her. But science cannot tell you whether you ought to do that in order to get your hands on her money. So science is limited. And it's very important to recognize that, because one of the problems with the naturalistic worldview is this dominant scientism, that science is the only way to truth. And I'm surprised at how many brilliant people adopt it, since it's very easy to disprove it.
Yeah, I want to bring here as a pushback one of the critiques that the naturalists will bring when they say that yes, science cannot explain anything yet, but should we talk about the God of the gaps then? That is to say, if we would give more time, science for sure will explain everything one day.
Well, there are several answers to that question, and I appreciate it's a very important question to ask, because many people, when they first encounter people like me, they think, oh, he simply believes in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. And as science advances, God will be squeezed completely out of the picture. Well, I do not believe in a God of the gaps. I think gods of the gaps are very dangerous. The ancient Greeks believed in a whole lot of them. The god of thunder, the god of lightning. And those gods are very easily destroyed by a little bit of elementary physics. But then I want to say that there are different kinds of gap. There are gaps that science can close, and that's marvelous when science gets rid of all these ancient Greek gods. But then there are gaps that science opens. Now, let me give you an example of one. In 1953, two men, Miller and Urey, won the Nobel Prize for discovering what was then thought to be the secret of life. They bombarded some chemicals which they thought would simulate the early Earth, and they discovered some of the amino acids out of which proteins are built. But that was 1953, and they hadn't discovered the origin of life, because we're actually further from a solution than we were then, because they didn't know, no one knew at the time, the sheer complexity of one of the fundamental molecules that's involved in life, that is the DNA molecule with its over 3 billion chemical letters in exactly the right order, like a code. Now, here's the important thing, that life has characteristics that fit perfectly into computer science and what we know of codes and languages. And the interesting thing about language is that when we see it, even a very limited few letters above a door, E-X-I-T, exit, we know, because we've learned a little bit of English or Latin in this case, that that means that this is the door to go out of. But we also know that because it has meaning, it's linguistic, whatever natural processes were involved in making the sign, there was a mind involved in producing it, because language is never produced, ever, by natural processes. And whether a person is a scientist or just an ordinary person, they will immediately deduce that. And that, to my mind, is extremely important, that the universe bears the marks of a language input at several levels, the most important of which are, firstly, the universe is, at least in part, mathematically describable. And every scientist believes that, otherwise you wouldn't do science. Now, the Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand." Well, no, it doesn't. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. That is everything. That is, God is the God of the whole show, not simply of the bits we don't understand. But it's even better than that. It's the bits we do understand that point towards the existence of God. Newton is an example of that himself. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he wrote the most important book in the history of science, the Principia. And he expressed at the beginning of it the hope that a thinking person reading this book would come to believe in a deity. In other words, Newton didn't say, "I've got a law of gravity. I now understand how it works. I don't need God." No, his reaction was, what a genius God is to do it that way. And that's very important. And that's the way life works. You know, if I understand painting and art, I will see much more in a Rembrandt picture or in a work of engineering beauty than the average person will, who's not trained. So I say, yes, let's get rid of the bad gaps. Let's squeeze out the bad gods. But, you know, even in ancient Greece, it's very interesting. There was one man, and he's called Xenophanes, and he mocked the ancient Greek gods. And but he said, there is one God, and I'm paraphrasing here, of great power. He saw that belief in one God who'd created the universe didn't contradict all these gods of the gaps. He wanted to get rid of the gods of the gaps so that they could concentrate on the true God. And therefore, I am totally convinced that science, in its good gaps, and it's interesting that my teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, Sir John Polkinghorne, the late Sir John, said we are unquestionably people of gaps. There are good gaps, and there are, it's ironic, of course, let me say this as well, that many people who adopt a strong evolutionary theory really have an evolution of the gaps. They don't know how anything happened, but they say evolution did it when they don't know how. And that is very much an evolution of the gaps.
I want to bring here Stephen Hawking, perhaps in his attempt to get rid of God of the gap, particularly in the need for a creator to explain the existence of the universe. And I took this quote from your book when he said, "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." Where do you think his reasoning went wrong?
Well, when I first read that, I thought, what? Because the sentence is completely illogical. And it's illogical for several reasons. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Well, cutting it down and just looking at it, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That's just a flat contradiction in logic. Secondly, the universe will create itself. Now, what does that mean? That's nonsense. If I say X creates Y, it roughly means that if I've got X, it'll produce Y somehow. But Hawking is saying X creates X. And that just shows, as I have been known to say, that nonsense remains nonsense, even if brilliant scientists talk it. Sadly, Stephen Hawking, he was a brilliant mathematician and theoretical physicist, but he had no idea about philosophy and no idea about theology. And in fact, our astronomer royal, Lord Martin Rees, said nobody should listen to him on either of those two things. But it's an absolute tragedy because he expected that, he believed that that was an argument that did away with God. It doesn't, it's just sheer nonsense. So he has not answered the famous question that Leibniz and other people posed: why is there something rather than nothing? They just haven't even addressed it. Because if you talk nonsense about something, you haven't advanced a solution to the question, have you?
So you think here we have the argument from authority in a sense, because I am an authority in a field, I can speak with authority of any field.
Well, that's a danger for any of us. And that's why, I mean, I'm a pure mathematician and I've been talking to you all the time about things beyond pure mathematics to a large extent. That's why I have found it very important in my life to always check with experts in the field that I'm talking about. But I cannot help noticing that people like Richard Dawkins often fail to do that. And that's anti-intellectual. We need to check with the best people. I mean, some folk these days, just taking something at random, will say there's evidence that Jesus never existed. Now, the existence of a historic figure is a matter of ancient history. There's scarce an ancient historian in the world, there may not even be one, who would take that view. And so when a scientist says that, like Bertrand Russell did, for example, they just have no knowledge of ancient history. And they're being, in that sense, anti-intellectual. They expect to be listened to in their own field because of their authority, but they won't consult authorities in other fields.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now, I know you debated Richard Dawkins, and I want to bring here his book, God Delusion. He ridicules educated Christians who believe in miracles, such as the virgin birth and the resurrection. Did you ever feel embarrassed for holding such beliefs?
Not at all. Not at all. Richard Dawkins' ridicule was very unwise because it's based on, I nearly said outdated philosophy, but it's based on false reasoning, seriously false reasoning. But because the person that originated it is the very famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, many people have embraced this idea. And the heart of it is this, that you can't possibly believe as an educated person in the kind of miracles we find in the New Testament because miracles are violations of the laws of nature. We know the laws of nature, therefore miracles are impossible. Well, I challenge that. I challenge that because miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. Let me explain that. C.S. Lewis is very helpful here. If I stay in a hotel at night and I suppose I put $100 into a drawer the first night, and I put 100 more the second night, so 1 + 1 = 2, as you said earlier, so I got $200 in the drawer. If I wake up on the third morning, open my drawer, and I find just $50 in the drawer, what do I deduce? Do I deduce that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or do I deduce that the laws of England have been broken? Now, it's that difference that shows what's going on. I deduce, of course, that the laws of England have been broken. Why? Because I know the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. If I thought the laws of arithmetic could be broken, I would say, well, 100 + 100 was 200 yesterday, now it's only 50. Well, so what? But I wouldn't do that, because it's the fact that I know that the laws of England have been broken that I can tell that a thief has put their hand into the drawer and stolen $150. Now, the interest of that illustration, and it's very simple, but it's very important, brings us back to the naturalistic worldview, which is usually that the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. But you see, just as my drawer was not a closed system, it was an open system that a thief could get into, so the universe is an open system. There is cause and effect, but it's the product of a creator who can, if he wishes, feed a new event in. The laws of nature can't stop that. You know, when Jesus turned water into wine, if you drank too much of that wine, you'd get drunk, according to the laws of nature. They take over, so to speak. But our formulations of the regularities in the universe don't imprison God so that he can't feed a new event in. And that is the crucial thing. You see, in order to recognize a miracle, and I don't believe, of course, in all claims to miracle. There are lots of spurious claims, but let's take a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus, which is the heart of Christianity. In order to recognize that, you've got to have an environment which runs most of the time according to recognized laws. Otherwise, you wouldn't recognize anything special if it happened. And so it's very important that we know the laws of nature, which we do thanks to Newton and others, but also that we grasp their status. They are not causes. Newton's laws of motion never caused a billiard ball or a snooker ball to move in the history of the universe. It's people with cues do that. The laws describe what happens, provided no one intervenes. For example, the law of gravity we were talking about means that if I drop an apple, it'll fall towards the center of the earth. But that doesn't stop you catching it on its way down.
That's great. Now, you mentioned it before that maybe we would talk a little bit about the rationality of naturalists or atheists to do science. Do you think they have like a good foundation there?
No. And here's the reason. Let me do it by way of telling a story because it illustrates it better. I often ask scientists what they do science with, and they often tell me about some very expensive machine, but then I just tap my head. Oh, they said, you mean my brain or my mind? Well, I said, I think the brain and the mind are different, but let's just go with the brain for the moment. You do science with your brain. Tell me about the brain. And the brief history of the brain, according to the naturalist, is the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, which didn't have it in view at all. And then I just smile at them and I say, and you trust it, do you? I said, now be honest with me. And this is the interesting thing, because I've done this many times. If you knew that the computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And you know, Kaon, I've always got the answer, no. Oh, I said, well, you've got a problem then, haven't you? Because you're telling me that the brain or the mind with which you do science is the end product of a mindless process. In other words, your naturalism or even materialism is undermining your trust in the very rationality, not only which you need to do science, the very rationality you need to construct any argument or have any discourse at all. And I often say, look, this naturalistic philosophy ends up by destroying science, in that it gives you no confidence in your doing of science. And I put it this way to get the point across. I said, if you shoot yourself in the foot, it's painful. If you shoot yourself in the brain, it's fatal. So that's what I mean by saying that there's a conflict between atheism and science. Alvin Plantinga made this point in one of his books, and he put it very well. It went something like this. He said there is superficial conflict between science and God, but deep concord. And there's superficial concord between science and atheism, but deep conflict.
Now, is it correct to say that those in the scientific world who are Christians are people of faith, and those who are not Christians are real scientists?
No. Every person is a person of faith. And I'm glad you asked this question, because it's one of the most important questions in this area. People, when they meet me, they say, you're a man of faith. Now, that is not a compliment in their view, because faith they think of in connection with words like ignorance, superstition, religion. For them, faith is a religious word, and it means believing where there is no evidence. And I say to them, you are completely wrong. Faith is an ordinary word. In English, it comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity, trustworthiness, and so on. It's equivalent in most languages to the word belief. So that if I say I have faith in something or I believe something, the next question to ask is, what evidence have you got on which to base that belief? Now, the idea that only people like me who are Christian believers or religious believers have faith is sheer nonsense. We have faith in God. But if you're going to do science, as I've just explained in my little story, you have to have faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe, in the fact that mathematics works. You cannot do science without that faith. And if you don't believe me, believe Einstein, who said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant the faith that's necessary for science. We all have a worldview that we believe. And it's almost laughable for Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens to say things like, scientists have no faith, and then writing a whole book on what they believe. It's a complete failure to see that their worldview is something they believe. And I try to make that point very strongly, because otherwise this idea that faith is a religious concept purely is wrong. So I never talk about, people ask me, they say, would you give a talk on faith and science? And I say to them, Do you want me to talk about God? Oh, yes. Well, I said, it's not in the title. Oh, yes, it is. Faith. I said, look, I can give you a talk about faith and science without mentioning God, because it'll be a talk about the way science depends on faith. Oh, I didn't mean that.
Mhm.
Well, then please make it clear that you're talking about faith in God and faith in science, because faith is used everywhere, especially in ordinary life, in human relationships, particularly. Trust is the key glue that holds society together. That's why we have so many lawyers. So it's a very sad business that the new atheists, Dawkins and co., have managed to convince many people that faith is believing where there's no evidence, and therefore it's superstitious ignorance. It is absolutely not. If I say I believe in Newton's law of gravity, then you can say, what's the evidence for that? If I say I believe Jesus rose from the dead, you've every right to say, and what's the evidence for that? And the reason I am a Christian believer, as I explain in that book, Can Science Explain Everything, is because I believe there's powerful evidence for it, both of an objective and a subjective kind.
That's excellent. As we coming toward the end of our conversation, I've learned that you have made a lot of visits during the Iron Curtain in Eastern European countries. And I want to ask you, what was significant about those visits concerning what atheism can cause to a society?
Well, during the Cold War, I went a lot to Hungary and East Germany in particular. And East Germany was the most interesting because you had evidence in their society of a repressive atheism. When the wall fell, because I can speak some Russian and lecture in it, I started going to places like Novosibirsk and academies in Russia. And it was amazing for me to discover. Let me give you just one incident that will explain what I found. I was chatting one night in a home of a applied mathematician, and at the end of the evening, he said to everybody, he said, look, all of you know, except our guest, which was me, that I am a strong atheist. I thought religion was for weak-minded people like old women and so on. But now, he said, in my own home, I hear arguments that I've never heard before, for which I have no answer, because I do not have the intellectual training to cope with them. And he turned to me and he said, please give me some time to think these things through. And that was a most interesting thing to learn, that he felt that the system that he'd been brought up under, apart from science, it did not teach people how to think critically. And they weren't able to evaluate anything because they were just told how it had to be in their books on atheism, of which there were plenty. So as a worldview, it was very limiting. And I was just pleased to get the first opportunities in that part of the world to explain that there was a very big difference, and that Christianity was associated with the rise of science. Now, he started with this, and it's very interesting that I gave the first lecture in the university at Novosibirsk in 75 years on this topic. And when I mentioned that Newton and so on were believers in God, I could see anger in the audience. They got really angry. So I stopped. I don't like angry people. And I asked a man in the front row, why are you angry? And he said, look, why were we never told that these scientists were believers in God? And I was amazed. I said, can you not guess? It didn't fit in with communist propaganda. So it did teach me that, well, one academician, a brilliant man, said to me, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. And too late we found out that that was impossible. So there's the realm not only of science, but of values that we talked about a little bit earlier. Science cannot deal with the matter of values. And scientism devalues people. And the atheistic worldview is not neutral. it does devalue people. And it leads to people like Dawkins saying the universe is just what we'd expect to be if at bottom there's no good, no evil, and no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's determinism as well. And I don't think Dawkins really believes that, because it's a dismissal of all morality. And he's one who talks about the problem of evil. Well, why talk about it if it doesn't exist?
Yeah, we as Albanians also have suffered that kind of communism. And to this day, I think we are having still the effects of what the communist worldview, naturalistic worldview of that system planted in our society. Unfortunately, we are still reaping the results of it. I think that's appropriate to end our conversation here. To respect your time also, I want to thank you so much for having this time for our program. I really appreciate, and I wish you good health and a fruitful ministry.
Thank you so very much. I'm honored to have been on this program.